Thank you for tuning in to this special episode of Movie Geeks United. Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now was released in theaters on August 15th, 1979, under a shroud of mystery and scandal. No other production in recent history had undergone such calamity. Would this ambitious war epic represent the downfall of the already legendary Godfather director? Once the world finally feasted their eyes upon Coppola's hallucinatory masterpiece, they were equally stunned and mystified. The film's massive scope and wholly unique vision was something none of us had witnessed on the screen before, and in the 40 years since its initial release, we're still penetrating its depths of accomplishment. Now, audiences have another opportunity to admire the film in a stunning third and, in Coppola's words, final cut of the film, which was recently showcased in limited theatrical IMAX screenings and will release on Blu-ray on August 27th. In this episode, we're celebrating the 40th anniversary of this landmark film by featuring an archived interview between Arenado Diaz of our sibling podcast Back by Midnight and the film's editor, Walter Murch. That interview will play right after this clip from our own 2009 interview with Coppola himself, where he addresses how he might take a different approach to Apocalypse Now if he were making it today.
If today you were going to make something like Apocalypse Now, would you still shoot on location, or would you give in more to doing a lot of it on the computer, a lot of more the effects and everything?
Well, that's an interesting question, because a lot of my thinking and my conviction that the cinema was going to be electronic came from sitting in the mud for hours upon hours waiting for the helicopters to arrive and being frustrated because, the pilots of those helicopters were afraid of the explosions that were going on below, so they were usually 10 feet higher than they were supposed to be. And any shot of Apocalypse Now where you see a lot of helicopters, you've got to realize that there were another 10 higher than you could see because they were afraid to come down low. So there were many frustrations, and of course the impact of the economic, the financial implications were so great that probably one wouldn't attempt a movie like that today, right, without benefiting greatly. Now, the use of effects and all the bag of tricks that you have at your fingertips today doesn't have to be in your face effects. They can be subtle, and they can be very convincing. But certainly in the days of war movies like Apocalypse or even Patton, before it, everything was done for real. I think the first time I saw the implication of what could be done in a new way of thinking was when Stanley Kubrick did Spartacus, and there's a famous sequence where the Roman legions are advancing, and a whole group of them advance and then stop, and then a whole other group of them advance and stop, and that wasn't done electronically. It was done, with optical printing, but it showed how you could manipulate a big crowd scenes in a way that would save, a trillion extras, and the die was cast, I think, at that moment. And in answer to your question, I don't know. Deep down in my heart, there are some films I'd love to make if it were possible to finance such a big production. And there's one story in particular, that a biographical story, that who knows, when I'm 80 or 85 years old, should I be lucky enough to live that long, I would have to direct on a donkey in order to get up and down the hills. And that one, I think I would do without the. There is no movie made today that doesn't in some way benefit from digital effects. Even when you don't see it or notice it, it's just there, and it's a servant, right, and it's become cheaper and cheaper every day, right, to use it. 15 years ago it was a big deal to use a digital effect or a compositing effect, to take the sky out and remove the television antennas, but now it's really modest cost, and everyone is doing it.
Yeah, now it's another tool in the artist's paint box. It's
for sure, and it's a miracle. It's a wonderful era right now in terms of where the technology has become comfortable even the projectors for movie theaters, we struggle to get a black and white film print to look as good as the present generation of electronic projection that's going to sweep through all the theaters, already is sweeping through all the theaters. Many benefits will accrue to it. It doesn't have to be misused as people are fearful of.
Right. Okay.
In 1976, following the critical and financial success of The Godfather Parts 1 and 2 and The Conversation, filmmaker Francis Ford Coppola set for the jungles of the Philippines to make what he thought would be the Irwin Allen of war films, a thrill ride into the heart of darkness. 3 years later, following typhoons, budget overruns, illness, and madness, what emerged was Apocalypse Now, one of the great cinematic achievements in the history of the medium. As Coppola breathlessly once said, "Our movie is not about Vietnam, it is Vietnam." From the Death Trip opening sequence, one of the greatest melding of image and music ever committed to celluloid, to the ride of the Valkyrie helicopter raid sequence, to the questing, concluding climax showing Marlon Brando coming to terms with his status as a legend. Apocalypse Now, like Raging Bull a year later, was a summing up of not only America's mood at the close of the 1970s, but American cinema itself. Late last week, I had the honor of speaking with Oscar-winning film editor and sound designer Walter Murch, who is responsible for Apocalypse Now, but also for THX 1138, and was a pioneer in sound design, including the creation of what is now the standard of 5.1 surround sound. It is a wonderful interview, in-depth, and a lot of factoids about Apocalypse Now. So here is my interview with Oscar-winning editor and sound designer Walter Murch.
As a really young teenager, like 11 and 12, I played around a lot with the early tape recorders that had just been made available, on a consumer basis.
Right.
And I discovered on my own that you could record something and then cut it up into little bits and then scotch tape those bits together in a different order than you recorded it. So I wasn't working with image yet, but I was already working with sound, and it was just kind of a serendipitous discovery that I made on my own that I later on learned was, the basis for all of the work that we do in film. The other thing was a screening, I think in the late 50s, so I must have been 16 or 17. I went to see Breathless, Godard's film, and I didn't know what the rules of film grammar were, consciously anyway, but I knew that they were being broken. That this approach to a film, which worked, I was very affected by the film, but I knew that the way it told itself was breaking conventions that I wasn't really aware of yet. So I set myself a goal to become more aware of what those conventions were and how you could break them.
Well, and then you go and you become part of a group of UCLA film students. I guess some would say probably part of the first true, real generation of UCLA film students, of Lucas and Coppola and other Milius and other people. And I'm just curious, it seems like in some of the readings that one has done about this era, that when y'all were together, it seems like early on it became kind of this, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you're going to be sound and editing, and one person was going to be writing, and one person was going to be directing, and it seemed like it was just kind of this collaborative thing of everyone's strengths coming together for a greater purpose. Is that true, or was there something even a little more to the dynamic?
Yeah, no, it's basically true, although there were two film schools involved. There was USC, which is where George Lucas and I went to school, and then there was UCLA, which is where Francis Coppola and Carol Ballard went to school. But we were all aware of each other, and we went to each other's screenings, and we kind of harassed the other guys, and they harassed us. But it was all, we knew that we were all young, aspiring filmmakers together and trying to change an industry or a business or an art that we felt needed some kind of new impetus, and the kind of collaborative let's do everything that we can do that ethic that came out of the film school, which encouraged us to be not concentrate on only one area, but to experience all different aspects of filmmaking. We tried to push that into the professional filmmaking aspect. So, I would be mixing one of Francis's films, but at the same time, Francis would be on his hands and knees trying to resolder the connection to the capacitor, and only he understood the electronics of this thing, even though I was the guy who was mixing it. And on THX 1138, even though I was hired to do the sound, I also was hired to work on the screenplay with George. So there was a real desire to cross barriers and to do everything that we could possibly do to investigate all of this, the potentials of filmmaking.
And the kind of the accepted history is that because of the invention of television, Hollywood, audiences were staying home. So Hollywood started to make the visual theater-going experience worthwhile of leaving your home. So we got all these widescreen formats and so forth. And it seemed, I'm curious, was there, if you know in particular an impetus of, well, we've done that with the visuals, now let's do something with the sound, because up to a certain point, stereo or, multi-track, it was kind of saved for either roadshow musicals or 70 millimeter, road shows, but it hadn't trickled down to just your Western or your action film or so forth. And so I'm curious, was there, if or what you feel is maybe the impetus of, great sound doesn't have to be just relegated to the 70 millimeter films or the musicals.
Right. Well, that was certainly a driving force. Although, just speaking personally, I didn't care anything about that at all, and I wasn't being driven by anything to do with the marketing of film. I just loved sound, and I loved how sound interacted with the image, and I just wanted to do that in every possible way. So there are also really two aspects to creative use of sound. Of course, there is I guess what you might call the expanded format, which is more channels, more high fidelity, and to a certain extent we all wanted that. But really more importantly is how do you use sound creatively to help you tell your story. And for that, you really don't need stereo at all. You can make a very effective film using sound and image together in mono. So, I don't know, THX 1138 was all done in mono. Godfather was all done in mono. Godfather 2 was all done in mono. We only began to work in stereo with Apocalypse Now, which was in the late 1970s.
Right, and I'm just curious, and this is just kind of I'm curious in a historical footnote way. Now since 3D has now become kind of a this safety crutch for a lot of Hollywood studios, it seems, and it's all because now there's more theaters equipped to show 3D films, and before they were resistant because there weren't enough theaters. And I'm curious, was there an aspect to this that a lot of theaters for a while weren't even equipped to do multi-channel?
Yeah, no, that's certainly the case. One of the big things that pushed Dolby Stereo into as many theaters as it did was the success of Star Wars. And George had made a very adventurous soundtrack and had used 6-track sound in 70 millimeter to do that. And Dolby Stereo Optical, which was a new format, was just coming online in 1976, 1977. And George wanted the film to play like that, and so the deal was, if you want Star Wars, you have to have this equipment to play it. And people were making so much money on Star Wars that they were and so anxious to get the film that they would buy this equipment. So it usually takes something like that, like an Avatar. A huge success of Avatar is something that brings a lot. If you want to show Avatar, you have to have the projectors to show it, and so the success of the film pushes the technology into the marketplace.
Right. I'm curious. You mentioned The Godfather 1 and 2 and so forth. So I am curious. Now when DVDs come out and movies get released, they always do a remix of the sound and upgrade it to obviously 5.1, which you invented. And I'm curious if you have a preference of like, well, yes, we can upgrade it, but I kind of wish I wish people would listen to Godfather and prefer the mono mix,
right,
what we did. Do you have a preference, or you don't mind the upgrading?
It's kind of on a case by case basis. For the DVD of Touch of Evil, even though it's technically all 5 channels are there, we just made it mono, so that it is the way Wells wanted it, and just simply because he isn't around anymore. He died back in 1985. We were reluctant to make the film into stereo because we would need his guidance in order to know how to do that. So we left it in mono. For The Conversation, Francis's film, which was originally in mono, we did a 5.1 on it, but it's very modest. The music is in stereo, and occasionally the surround channels and occasionally the subwoofer channels are activated, but it's very you would almost be forgiven for looking at the film and thinking that it was just in mono. Godfather 1 and 2 are slightly more expanded, but not really very much. So I would hesitate to do a full-blown 5.1 mix for a film that had been originally in mono.
Yeah, I kind of admire whenever they re-release Kubrick's films on DVD and Blu-ray. They still keep it in. It's funny it's funny, but it's also quite. You realize how good it is. Like something like Full Metal Jacket is just in its mono mix.
Yeah. No, it relates to what I was saying earlier. Just once you adjust yourself to the parameters of any format, what you really then concentrate on is the creative use of the kind of sounds that are being used and what placement they have and how they relate to what's going on with the story and the image and how all of that boils together. I mean, Touch of Evil has a fantastically adventurous soundtrack, but it's in mono.
Right.
Well, and Kubrick, even in his mono films, he mixed with a restricted dynamic range. So he wasn't even taking advantage of the full potentials of the mono mix, because that was a creative decision on his part, was to keep the loudest sounds in the film not that much louder than average dialogue.
Right. Well, I guess we should talk about Apocalypse Now, which is what we're here to talk about. And then, I guess, so you had quite a task on this, because you were not only the sound designer, if you will, but also the editor on this film. So you saw 2 massive, tasks on this film. And so I assume editing came first. And if I'm not mistaken, there was over 1 million feet of film that was printed, and there are teams of editors kind of just going through this film at a certain point. Is that correct?
Yeah, there were 3 picture editors on the film at any one time. So I was one of those editors, and in fact, I was a late comer to the process. I didn't start working on Apocalypse Now until after all of the primary footage had been shot. Mm-hmm. I actually had 3 jobs on the film. I was one of the picture editors. I was the sound designer, which is to say I was responsible for the overall integration of the sound and image and coming up with ideas and approaches for that, and the designing of the 5.1 soundtrack, which was originated on Apocalypse Now. But I was also one of the re-recording mixers, so I was sitting at the desk alongside Mark Berger and Richard Beggs, and we were pushing the faders and making all of this, and panning the sounds around the room and making all of this happen. But we had a lot of time to do it, relatively speaking. I was on the film for almost 2 years, and that was after the principal photography. So, there was a lot to do, but we had the time to do it.
Let's talk about the 5.1, this was the first time to use 5.1. What was the genesis of 5.1, and also tell people specifically what is 5.1, because I think unless you're not an audiophile, people accept it's 5. They accept 5.1 as a standard. But what is 5.1?
Well, to take that question first, it's when we were doing it, we just called it 6-track. The reason it's called 5.1 is that it's 5 channels of sound. Like ordinary stereo is 2 channels of sound. Mm-hmm. This is 5 channels of sound with an extra channel which carries only super, super low frequencies on it. So you would never find dialogue or birds or music on that. It would just be the kind of the frequencies that give oomph to whatever else is going on in the rest. So of those, the remaining 5 channels, there are 3 channels of sound behind the screen, left a speaker, a right speaker, and then 1 speaker in the center, and then there are 2 channels of sound in the rear of the theater and the sides. So there is a left back and sides, and then there is a right back and sides. So it's also what we call split surround. It surrounds, but it has a directionality to it, and that allows you to take a sound and pan it, and move it all the way around the theater from the left, from the right rear to the left rear to the left front, and then across the screen, which is how the first sound in Apocalypse Now, how it moves, the sound of those helicopter blades as they move around the theater. So it had its origins in when Francis was shooting Apocalypse Now. He heard some music by Tomita, the Japanese composer who works electronically, and this had been done in quadraphonic sound, which is 4 channels, kind of like a speaker in the corner, in each corner of a square room would be a quadraphonic soundtrack. And he loved what he heard, and he said, this is how I want Apocalypse Now to sound. And in talking to me about this, he said, well, see if you can make this happen somehow. And this was not an established format for motion pictures at the time, so I started investigating it and came to the realization that we needed at least 5 channels because if you put 1 speaker in the corner of a theater, in each corner of a theater, the dialogue for the film would tend to skew to the left for somebody sitting on the left, or to the right for somebody sitting on the right. So we needed an extra channel of the center speaker right behind the screen, and 90% of the dialogue for the film would go to that speaker. And then Francis said that he also wanted the explosions and the music to have this super low frequency so that when they happened, you felt them as much as you heard them. So you felt them in your gut as much as in your ear. And that meant another channel, which would have just this super low frequency on it. And that's over the course of probably a year, that's eventually how this all evolved into the format that is now it's the standard format for motion pictures. When you mix a motion picture now, that's the format that you do it in. Whereas when we were making Apocalypse Now, this really didn't exist. This was a format that we were creating for this film itself. And part of Francis's original dream was that this film would play only in one theater in the country, somewhere in the geographic center of the country, in Kansas somewhere. And it would be, I guess, what you'd recognize today as an IMAX theater. You wanted to build a huge theater that had a big screen and this fantastic sound system, and people would come from all over the country to this theater to see the film. And it would be very long at that time. He thought the film might be 5 or 6 hours long, and you'd see 2.5 hours of the film, and then there would be a break. You'd have dinner at this place, talk about the film, and then you'd see the last 2.5 hours. So there was this kind of wonderful, mad dream for a sort of Mount Rushmore theater that would attract people. But the residue of this that has stayed with us is, on the one hand, the 5.1 format, which is how almost all films are done today, and the IMAX theater, which have proliferated over the country. Every big city now has at least one IMAX screen.
Right. Well, and just as a footnote, I'm curious, just explain real quickly what exactly, because now you're seeing in some mixes and on Blu-rays and some theaters, you're seeing 6.1 and even 7.1. What does that do?
Right. Well, these are, let's say, they're extensions of that, just adding more channels principally to the back, so that instead of having just a left and a right in the back, there's a sort of mid-left on the side of the theater, and then a back left behind your head. And the same thing for the right. That would be 7.1, 6.1. There was, I think that's where there is a channel in the ceiling of the theater, so that sounds can seem to come from right above the audience.
Right. But well, I guess to get back to Apocalypse Now, and so the opening shot, which is one of the most famous shots in film history of this, we see this napalm explosion. We see these kind of the bottom of this helicopter kind of going by in shadow,
right?
And then we hear these blades, and then the Doors music comes on. And the Doors music, the opening of the music is this kind of fill of the cymbal, the first kind of note, if you will. So I'm guessing, just if you can take us through where each sound had to go in a certain place and make sure it panned properly. Is that correct? To make sure it really gave this almost 360 enveloping feel.
Right. Right. I should just say before we get into that the shot that begins Apocalypse Now was really a kind of an accidental shot that was requested by A.D. Flowers, who was doing all of the explosions and munitions on the film. And this napalm explosion was the largest explosion for a film that had ever been done at that time, and probably ever, because now much of this would be done digitally. You wouldn't do such a big explosion, but in 1976, when this was shot, you had to do it for real. Anyway, he requested this extra camera at high speed with a telephoto lens to document the explosion. Francis saw it and just got completely entranced by the shot and thought, well, this is a great beginning to the movie. So that was how the beginning of the movie happened. The sound that begins the film is this kind of abstract sound of what might be a helicopter blade, and this was what we, in doing the film, called the ghost helicopter, because it was not a real helicopter. It was, I guess, the audio equivalent of a Lego kit. We analyzed all of the elements that go into what makes the sound of a Huey helicopter, and then we pulled those apart and tried to duplicate each one of those electronically. So we had the sound of the blade electronically, we had the sound of the turbine electronically, we had the sound of the gears, the kind of metallic sound of the helicopter. There were 5 or 6 components of it, and when you put all those together, it sort of sounded like, okay, that's sort of like a real helicopter. But we could also pull them apart and just have each one of these separately. And so we used the blade sound at the beginning to just give you this sort of unearthly, what is this kind of a sound, because you don't even see any helicopters at that point. And to, right from the beginning, to demonstrate to the audience the kind of sounds that they would be hearing and how they would be moved around the theater, I placed that sound in the right rear surrounds. So very unusually, I think probably uniquely, here's a big film, and the first sound you hear comes out of the back of the theater and off to the right in addition. And then I panned that to the left in the back and then to the front. And then only when it hit the center did you see the image of a helicopter, and now you realize that this sound is somehow connected with this strange telephoto image of a fragment of a helicopter.
Right. And it's an unusual sequence in that it's actually a sequence that is not most films, they want to get the audience just in the story and believe the story is real and moving forward. But this is actually a sequence that, in its own way, does call attention to itself and tells an audience, well, we're going to get into the story, but first we're also making it aware you are watching a movie and something that is different.
Yeah, the movie ends up in a very strange place, and Francis wanted the beginning of the film to give you a hint of where this film was going to go. So it's kind of like a prelude for an opera, or for operas. There's a prelude, maybe a 5-minute section of music that familiarizes the audience with all of the themes that they're going to be hearing in the next 2 hours. And so this is visually and sonically sort of the equivalent of that. And plus, it without saying it overtly, it shows you that you're going to be experiencing this all from a particular point of view, which is the head of this sort of wasted special operations assassin, the character of Willard. And as we go through the film, in fact, everything that we see because he is looking at it and he's experiencing this. So he's our guide to this hellish environment. And that's established very clearly at the beginning, what this environment is and how warped his particular perspective on this is.
I'm curious, in bringing up Willard, Martin Sheen's character, And so you're creating a sound, and so I'm curious about the process of his voiceover. Obviously, it was recorded after the film. And so, do you happen to know? I guess my question is twofold. One, was his voiceover, I know Michael Herr came in and wrote it. So, was it kind of a case of, we want to use his voiceover, but is it through the editing process that y'all figured out, well, this is a good time for a piece of narration, or were certain scenes marked of like this will be a narrated passage?
There was narration in the original screenplay, so it was something that was worked out right from the beginning that this film would, the central character of this film would speak to us through narration. The twist in this is that when I joined the film, Francis told me that he decided not to use narration, and I thought, okay. And I started looking at the film, and then he told me that he wanted to have the film finished by December of that year, which was 1977, which was only 5 months away at this point. And I thought, I don't know, how is that possible? Because the script was shot as if there were narration, and now we're not going to use narration. And so I campaigned to restore the narration, and to the extent that I recorded the narration myself to begin with, just to show that it could work. And I sold Francis on the idea of restoring the narration, and once everyone agreed that this was a good idea, then we brought in Michael Herr to write narration that really fit the film the way it was evolving in the editorial process. And obviously we brought Marty Sheen in to re-record the narration. And we recorded the narration very intimately, so the microphone was very close to his mouth when he spoke, and he spoke very low like this about what was going on. And then in the mixing, we spread the narration out across all three speakers behind the screen, which allowed you, without really knowing what was going on, it clearly differentiated this sound from the dialogue of characters in the film, which mostly only came out of the center speaker.
Right. I'm curious about. So let's flash forward a little, and Redux becomes starts getting underway, and so what was that? I mean, there's 49 minutes of extra footage, and so did this footage have to be, how did this footage have to be worked on? Was this stuff already completed and it's just a matter of inserting it, or was there actually having to actually do sound work and complete some of these sequences?
Yes, no, none of this was in any form at all. We went back to the original uncut negative for these scenes and reprinted the negative and retransferred the sound as if the film was being shot in the year 2000, which is when we were working on it. Mm-hmm. So I recut these new sections from scratch, and we did all of the sound mixing and everything from scratch, and then blended it so that it fit the fabric of the existing film with these new sections blended in.
Wow. And I'm not mistaken, was there a need for new narration or narration for those scenes? I mean, I've read, I don't know how true this is, I've read that some narration was needed, and Mr. Sheen's brother was used also because he was more or less a sound-alike in certain parts.
No.
I don't know if that's true or not.
Marty Sheen had a heart attack during shooting,
right,
and and his brother was used to shoot some over-the-shoulder shots while they were trying to keep the film going as Marty got better. But in the mix, no, he didn't. Marty Sheen did all the narration, and there was a couple of extra lines of narration added to Redux.
Okay. And so when you've been with this film for going on 23 years now. I mean, it's I take it back, 33 years you've been with this film.
That's right. Yeah.
Now it's in Blu-ray, which is probably the best it's ever looked and sounded in a home entertainment format.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what do you think about when you look back at a film editorially and sonically? Because I do consider the conversation personally just as innovative. A film, both editorially and sonically, but obviously the conversation is a much more intimate film.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing of Apocalypse Now, there's rarely been a film of this scale since it's been made. I'm curious, what do you think when you every now and then when you think about it, what pops into your mind the most?
Well, we were. All of us who were working on the film back then knew that it was an extraordinary film. It was teetering on the edge of chaos all the time during shooting, and in the post-production, we tried to wrestle that chaos to the ground and bring it to a successful evolution, but while respecting its sort of divine madness of the whole film and the enterprise, because it was trying to get at a very difficult issue of America's involvement in Vietnam, but also beyond that, why do human beings do this crazy stuff like engage in war, and what sort of twists does this cause the human psyche to go through? So there was physical, very adventuresome physical demands. The shooting was over 250 days, I think, in the jungles of the Philippines. But there was also a very strong psychic dimension, which came from the original novel, Heart of Darkness, which is what the film is based on. And Francis really wanted to respect that as well, and yet also fuse it into the present and hopefully the future. So I'm very happy that it has this long afterlife. It was not something that we could really forecast in any of its details in 1977, because at that point, not even the VHS home video stuff hadn't really even taken off. So the fact that we're now here, a generation or so later, having gone through videotape and now into DVDs and now into Blu-rays and who knows what in the future, I'm just very happy and amazed that it's taken all these different turns.
Well, there's two questions, and one relating to Apocalypse, to kind of go with this kind of controlled chaos that this production was kind of in. Is there a sequence in the film that was kind of the one that was the hardest to bring together, but is also in the end the one that when you see the film, that's the sequence you're like, that's the one I'm proudest of, or that's the sequence that I worked the hardest on to come together as an editor and a sound designer.
Mm. Well, just speaking personally, it didn't. It wasn't particularly hard to come together, but it was a scene that I suggested for the film after the film while the film was being shot, and that I wrote the first draft of, which was the scene where they stop a sampan in the middle of the river, and there's something goes wrong, and all of the people in the sampan get killed. So I'm particularly fond of that because my personal involvement with the screenplay at that point. Logistically, probably the the helicopter attack, the whole Kilgore sequence, which was mainly the work of Jerry Greenberg, the editor.
Right. Terrific editor. I've spoken to him before. I've spoken to him before. He's a terrific editor.
That was really where you really felt the power of this whole sound format that we developed in a very complicated action sequence. The beginning, because it really is sort of is free-form filmmaking. The fact that it comes off as well as it does is, I'm happy with.
Right. Well, and here's my last question. This is not Apocalypse Now related, but this is something I've always wanted to ask. Someone who's a real pioneer in this field, and then I am curious on the way certain editing jobs and also sound jobs don't seem to get noticed either critically or even by certain sections of the peer groups. And that I was wondering if you think that maybe if we run the risk of, just because a film is edited real quick and fast, or if a sound mix is loud and overpowering, that gets mistaken for, well, it must be a superior work, as opposed to something that's subtle and almost invisible. And I bring this up recently because I've been doing a continuing series on David Fincher's work, and the impetus was The Social Network, which for my mind, I've seen the film twice. I'm going to see it a couple more times, and it seems to be one of the most sophisticated editing jobs and sound design jobs I've seen all year. But it's one that's not obtrusive and calls attention to itself. And it seems to me that doesn't seem to be valued as much. I was wondering if you shared that point of view.
Yeah, I would say that's generally what happens. If you look at all the films that win Best Sound, it's usually war films or films with lots of explosions and gunfire in them, or they are musicals. And this is voting that's being done by industry professionals. So even we, who are the industry professionals, tend to say, yeah, the film that has the best sound is the loudest sound that's got the most explosions or singing in it. And that's, as you just indicated, absolutely not the case. That I greatly admire the work that Angus Wall and his team did on Social Network in the editing, and that Ren Kleiss and his team did in the sound on the film. I think it's a fantastic job for exactly the reasons that you said. And it's just, I think it's just part of human nature, and I'm kind of resigned to it. I don't think it'll ever appreciably change, and that's partly also good, because the editing of a film, the picture editing, and particularly the sound use of sound, can have a tremendous influence on the audience. But it can have that kind of influence precisely because the audience is not really aware of how it is influencing them. So I actually wouldn't want the audience to be overconscious of the kind of things that are going on editorially or in sound, because to become too conscious of it, that would in fact reduce the power of what it is that we're doing